So with that, we'll get right into the speakers. First up is Andrew Martinez, currently at the University of Arizona, although I think spatially and new in different places. And Andrew is an enrolled member of the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community and has been working for the last couple of years with this really amazing initiative, I think more or less based out of University of Arizona with the CARES principle. So bringing in Indigenous data sovereignty into how we think about managing data. And so we're going to hear from him for the next couple of minutes. Over to you, Andrew. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Eva. Also, thank you everyone else who helped organize this session. I'm excited to be here to talk to everyone today because we've honestly been seeing over the last, I think, 5 years since I've been working in this space, a lot of momentum based off a lot of advocacy around the movement and growth and development of Indigenous data sovereignty and how that is then transformed into a push for greater data governance by tribal peoples, Indigenous peoples, and now with the recent publication of the CARES principles to align with the FAIRS principles and even mesh with potentially the trust principles for data governance. And so today, I'm excited to talk to you about operationalizing the CARE principles. And today it will be a bit of a background foundation information on where we came from and what couple definitions through a bit of the actions that are happening now and with future recommendations. And so to get started, Skuktash Ananabjugi, Andrew Martinez. I'm, as Eva mentioned, I'm enrolled in Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community. I'm Tanatham, Degenio, and Yaqui. I grew up in San Diego County. And yes, I'm currently employed by the University of Arizona at the Native Nations Institute. But I'm currently coming to you from Davis, California. So to get started, I would like to begin with this slide here. As part of our discussion, sorry, let me mention this and turn off my screen to make sure there's no glitches from my end here with the animations or anything. So this slide is from my colleague, Dr. Dominique David Chavez, who developed a scale of levels of Indigenous community engagement and research to assess for how researchers access Indigenous knowledge systems and how they engage with communities and community members who maintain those systems. Adapted from a participatory agricultural research framework, it is based on who holds authority and governance in the research process, ranging from no engagement representing extractive processes on the left to self-determined Indigenous-led processes on the right. Applied to a global systematic review analyzing 20 years of climate studies that included Indigenous knowledges in their research, Dr. David Chavez found that 87% of studies were extractive, representing colonial legacies. Yet there are a handful of studies, as well as numerous grassroots community efforts that live on the self-determined end of the scale. So a question we continuously ask ourselves is, how do we move institutions from extractive, transactional, colonial data practices and reconfigure power relationships to put Indigenous data in Indigenous hands? And one of the ways we begin our talks is reminding, in some cases informing folks, that our peoples have always been data experts. Indigenous knowledge systems are informed by longitudinal inquiry lasting in generations. Indigenous communities form, test, adapt, refine their knowledge systems based upon careful observations. Many Indigenous cultures utilize a variety of oral and physical mechanisms for transmitting knowledge and information. These are a few examples that we use within our presentation. So on the left, we have a totem poles. On the top center, we have Lakota winter counts. On the bottom center, we have the wampum belts. And on the right, we have an autumn calendar stick, which is actually from my culture in Arizona. These calendar sticks are made out of the saguaro or Hashan ribs and can be as long as 12 feet tall, etched with depictions that were of events that happened throughout the years. So in some cases, you can see the larger range on the sizes here. So these are traditional forms of data storage. Today, Indigenous peoples' data include data generated by our people, as well as by non-Indigenous governance, the private sector, and other institutions on and about Indigenous peoples and territories. Indigenous peoples' data comprise information and knowledge about the environment, lands, skies, resources, and non-humans, which they have relations. Information about Indigenous individuals, such as administrative, census, health, social, commercial, corporate, and information and knowledge about Indigenous peoples as collectives, including traditional and cultural information, oral histories, ancestral and clan knowledge, cultural sites, stories, and belongings. So here's our definition of Indigenous data. It's very broad, but that's because we take a lot of input from many different communities. Indigenous data sovereignty is the right of Indigenous peoples to govern their data from collection and storage to use and reuse. Finding its foundations in inherent sovereignty, only Indigenous peoples and nations as rights holders can exercise Indigenous data sovereignty. Is responsibility and expression of ways, traditions, and roles that communities have had for the care and use of their knowledge. Using a human rights framework, Indigenous data sovereignty leverages tools such as laws, policies, and agreements, including the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, nation-state recognition of Indigenous peoples. In the US, that's a federal recognition process, treaties, and other mechanisms. I should also include the state recognition process. Indigenous data sovereignty underscores that knowledge belongs to the collective and is fundamental to who we are as Indigenous peoples. Data are critical to the exercise of tribal sovereignty. Indigenous peoples require data for governance and self-determined decision-making. When activating Indigenous data sovereignty, Native nations and other data agents replace external non-tribal norms and priorities with tribal systems that define data, control how it's collected, and influence how it is used. It results in findings derived both from external data collected on Indigenous peoples and from internal data produced by Native nations that reflect the understandings of those peoples. At the same time, Indigenous nations, like many other governments and institutions, create and enact data policies and practices that align with the values and knowledge systems. These activities of Indigenous data governance are a means of implementing greater Indigenous data sovereignty. What we see now is that as Indigenous nations rebuild their governance systems, they are also reclaiming their data systems. And so we have the cyclical figure here, where we have Native nation building on the left, enacting data governance practices, rebuilding their data systems, and then applying that data that they've earned or developed into data for governance. Over the past 5 years, there have been scholarship pointing to the bottom right-hand corner of the Indigenous Data Sovereignty book and Indigenous Data 2 books, as well as frameworks and principles for Indigenous data governance at various levels, including international for First Nations in Canada, which are the OCAP principles, which are ownership, control, access, and possession, and then the Maori and Aotearoa, New Zealand. In response to the increased generation and use of data in open data, big data, open science, and research environments and limited opportunities for Indigenous control, a network of Indigenous scholars led the development of the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance, which are listed here on the left. In 2019, the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, or GIDA, released the CARE principles, which are collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics, as their sub-principles, sorry. These principles set forth the critical considerations for non-tribal data creators, stewards, and users, and are designed to guide the inclusion of Indigenous peoples in data governance and increase their access to data. The CARE principles shift the focus of data governance from consultation to values-based relationships, and have been widely recognized as enriching the discussion of collective rights to data for other populations as well. The CARE principles bring a people and purpose orientation to the data governance, which complements the data-centric nature of the popular FAIR principles, which are findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. FAIR principles seek to increase data sharing. The implementation of CARE and FAIR principles together should be seen as necessary to allow Indigenous peoples to govern, access, and use their data and to share on their own terms. Currently, the vast majority of Indigenous data, ranging from ethnographic material to biological materials to Earth observations and so on, are neither FAIR nor CARE. Indigenous collections and data can be hard to find. They can be buried in large collections, data set repositories, and researcher possessions. Indigenous data are often mislabeled, do not indicate the Indigenous peoples who they are related to those data, and are not searchable. Indigenous peoples largely are the legal rights holders. Thus, Indigenous collections and data are not fair and do not perpetuate Indigenous provenance, protocols for use and sharing, or permissions. We are concerned about implementing fair and care on an already existing data, as well as instituting policies and practices to operationalize fair and care in the ongoing creation of new data that incorporates Indigenous knowledges. Some of the tools that make this a reality using Indigenous people's own laws, policies, and practices, and investing in Indigenous data systems. Updating other governments and institutional policies and practices is another necessary step towards ethical inclusion of Indigenous knowledge and external data systems. The goal is to create law, policy, ethics, and infrastructure to support Indigenous rights to Indigenous data throughout the data lifecycle and across the data ecosystem, and to strengthen the rights of such rights by making changes, even minimal at first, across data actors such as research institutions, repositories, publishers, funders, and more. Next, I will highlight a few brief examples. And before I switch over to the next slide, I'd like to highlight the TK, BK, BC, and then institutional labels and notices, which I'll go deeper into. These are metadata tags that have been produced by a local context. As we move into discussing some of the institutional and organizational responsibilities and recommendations in relation to Indigenous data, it is important to acknowledge that there's no one-size-fits-all approach. However, with that in mind, I highlight some key responsibilities and recommendations for enhancing data governance practices and for incorporating more equitable and just frameworks into data policies and practices. All of the responsibilities and recommendations we identify in this presentation are centered around the broader theme of building the care principles into the development of data policy and platforms. A few ways in which we'll talk about this specifically are by enriching metadata, recognizing Indigenous intellectual property through appropriate authorship and acknowledgement, protect both personal and community identifiable information, formalize voluntary guidelines, and track use and reuse. One way of enriching metadata can be to put into action is through the use of traditional knowledge labels, biocultural labels, and notices, which are the three labels that I called out on the previous slide in the data lifecycle. The local context labels and notices were developed in partnership with Indigenous communities globally to enhance Indigenous data governance and to establish the conditions for sharing and reuse of Indigenous knowledge and intellectual property in digital spaces. Another related and important piece of promoting Indigenous data governance is related to attribution and authorship. Often individual researchers and groups from outside of our communities are the ones credited and cited in relation to Indigenous or local knowledge, since their names are associated with data sets, publications, and research findings. These groups often do not have the same responsibilities to the communities and may not be accountable to knowledge holders when sharing the data with third parties. At the same time, it is also important to acknowledge that different communities may have different needs and perspectives related to authorship. Some may want to restrict community-level identifiers, which would include authorship in some cases, and others may want to be acknowledged for their contribution, in which case authorship is an important consideration. Again, there's no one-size-fits-all for how this can be done. An example of this is with some academic journals are including relevant statements that ultimately affect whether a publication is considered or not. Similar statements could be made for data sets on whether or not it is included in repositories. This example is from the Global Health Action Author Guidelines. Tags like this one in the metadata of existing information would help recognize existing shortcomings and could be made a requirement for depositing researchers to address. Data repositories have a responsibility to ensure that researchers and groups are engaging in strong partnerships. Traditionally, the protection of human subjects through institutional review boards has focused on the individual level. However, this focus is embedded in Western and colonial values centered on individualism and fails to account for Indigenous collective rights, values, and community-centered perspectives. The importance of reducing harm, the importance of justice and respect should extend to the collective level when engaging with Indigenous peoples to maximize benefits and prevent harmful misrepresentations, generalizations, and exploitation of communities. A sole focus on personal identifiable information as sensitive then fails to fully identify the potential risks and harms of research and how those risks can affect our future generations. This kind of formalization is being implemented by other institutions. For example, there are some of the ESIP goals for implementing fair and care principles that relate to formalizing better research ethics and practice. I'd like to point out the last one, engaging with intellectual property review processes to assist in determining appropriateness for the repository for certain types of data. Data are confidential and sensitive. Track data use and reuse. The final recommendation we want to make today surrounds research, reporting, and compliance as it relates to tracking and the use and reuse of Indigenous data. Since repositories often measure, assess, and track research outputs as part of open access, tracking could include creating a mechanism that identifies who and how data are accessed and used. With this type of tracking, it's possible to determine the future data uses are consistent with community values and protocols. This is critical to mitigate harm since data used by third parties is even further removed from its local context. And while appropriate permissions to reuse won't be able to be fully recognized until something like a TK or BC label are included or until repositories facilitate community permissions to data use and reuse, tracking the reuse of data is a first step in identifying how data is being used in ways that do or do not align with our community values and protocols. Examples of this in practice involve data access review committees who evaluate whether the project aligns with informed prior consent before granting data access. Ideally, these would be Indigenous-led. While this list of recommendations is not exhaustive, we want to recognize that many organizations and groups are currently promoting Indigenous data governance and grounding data management in practice and care principles. To name just a few, there's the GIDA, Global Indigenous Data Alliance, local context from which the TK, BC labels came from, and then the United States Indigenous Data Governance Network. And that is my talk today. So hopefully I didn't go too fast there for you. And this is a general presentation that we give to new folks and see how it can be applied later in further discussions to the work that everyone does. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. That was great. We don't have questions yet in the chat. Oh no, local case studies. I bet we'll get to that when we get to the discussion, because we're going to hear from two more folks, and I bet there will be some things that'll be useful. Thank you so much, Andrew. That is so helpful. We set it up with this order of having Andrew go first, which will be followed by Karl here in just a second, because we at Quivira and at Carbon Ranch, we're aspiring and working towards making our data management first criteria is that we meet the care principles, and then second criteria is that we meet the FAIR principles. And so since we're organizing this webinar, we decided to match that order for you all as well as a way of considering how you might think about things. So with that, we've just learned what the care principles are and got to touch on some of the other parts of the data lifecycle, which there's lots more information about that, and we can provide resources if people have questions. But moving on, we've got Karl Benedict here from the UNM, University of New Mexico Libraries. I met Karl when I was a grad student, learning about all of this data and how we deal with it. And I definitely still to this day cross paths with him, asking him hard questions. So thank you so much. Karl has just decades of experience with especially sort of earth science data and GIS technologies and that sort of thing, but more broadly with how we educate people and track and manage this data. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Karl.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, hopefully you can see my screen now. And yes, I'm Karl Benedict, and I'm here in the University Libraries here at the University of New Mexico. And there's my contact information, my email address, if you'd like to reach out to me. And I always like to start out with some brief introductions of sort of the context in which I come to these questions, and then dive a little bit more deeply, and then try to provide some resources to be able to follow up with in terms of building knowledge and skills. And so that's the basic structure of what I'm going to be going through today. And I was very appreciative of Eva's introduction in terms of the land and territory acknowledgement, as it is critical that as we talk about the management of data and information, and we are active in the lands of wherever we live and work, that we acknowledge those that have come before us and have been subject to removal from their lands and all of the other impacts of the colonial history that we all have lived through and are a part of. So just as Eva described, the university as well sits on the traditional homelands of the Pueblo of Sandia, and more broadly, the original peoples of New Mexico, Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache, since time immemorial, have had deep connections to the land and made significant contributions to the broader community statewide. And that continues to this day. We honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land through the generations, and also acknowledge our committed relationship to the indigenous peoples of New Mexico and more broadly. And we gratefully recognize our history and recognize both the negative and positive aspects of our history. And Eva provided an excellent, even more broad context for why and how we should continue to acknowledge this history for ourselves. As I said, I usually start out with a little bit of background for myself. And for this presentation, I think it's particularly useful because it helps to illustrate a lot of dimensions of the FAIR principles that I'll be talking about, and the different ways in which we all potentially interact with data and information. So starting out, I've been in the field of collecting, analyzing, and working with data for now coming on 35 years. As I'm actually, now I'll periodically describe myself as a recovering archaeologist. As a freshly minted undergraduate, I worked for the U.S. Forest Service, doing field work in the Central Sierra, spending a lot of time measuring bedrock mortars and identifying archaeological sites in the landscape so that they could be protected from activities that were going on, largely associated with the catastrophic wildland fires in the mid-'80s that now pale in comparison to the significant fires that are happening now. I've also worked for the National Park Service doing data analysis with some of the parks here in New Mexico, and also worked in the private sector doing archaeological data collection and analysis, in that case related more to pipeline and reservoir projects. But in all of those cases, there was an underlying theme of collection and stewardship of data, and making sure that those data are safe and protected, and that the resources that those data represent are also provided the protection that they need. But I've also been a beneficiary, as Andrew noted, of that colonial legacy of not considering indigenous peoples in their governance and their rights to governance and ownership of data. As my dissertation work in the 1990s and the early 2000s was based on archaeological data that had been collected in the 1960s through the 1980s in a region of northeastern Arizona. And those data were available to me through the archival collections in Arizona and in Illinois, and access to them was essentially unmediated by any input from the tribal nations that these data relate to and were collected on. And so, in many respects, I'm even more sensitive and appreciative of the emergence of the care principles as a systematic way of being able to describe and provide guidance for effective consultative and collaborative work with native nations in the effective governance of the data that relate to them and are collected by them.
Could you say that again?
And so this is one part of my history, but I've also, since then, as I defended my dissertation in 2004, I had already started sort of the second phase of my work more broadly in geospatial data and applications when I started working at the Earth Data Analysis Center. And in particular, starting to work in developing web applications to manage and make data discoverable based on the documentation or metadata that are associated with those. And this is just three illustrations of the continuous development of New Mexico's Resource Geographic Information System. In the top right is the first instance of the online version of ARGIS that I myself built in 2001. Sort of in the middle left is the next version of the system in around 2011 that was developing even greater capabilities in terms of being able to provide different ways of interacting with the data in the system. And then in the lower right is the current instance of ARGIS. And one of the key principles here associated with ARGIS and some of the other applications that we worked at in the Earth Data Analysis Center is the use of both rich metadata that Andrew talked about and the need for integrating into metadata the additional elements that can represent the data governance and components, but also the use of other open standards for providing access to and use of data. And this has certainly been a part of the work that I've done at the Earth Data Analysis Center. Starting now about 10 years ago, but continuing full-time about 8 years ago, I started working in our university libraries, directing our research data services program with a focus more broadly on supporting researchers across the entire campus in planning how to manage their data, helping support their management, analysis, and sharing and preservation of the data that they're generating, providing training and workshops for how they essentially how they can improve their data management skills, and then also working with other campus groups to develop institutional capacity and policy around data. And the values that Andrew was talking about in terms of the care principles and the sequence of work that Eva just described in terms of focusing on the principles around the data and then transitioning to a focus on how you embed those values and how you provide access to those data is entirely the best way to go, because we have a long legacy of providing access to data without consideration of the underlying principles for that access. So in 2016, the publication highlighted here was published in the Nature Scientific Data Journal. And it outlined for the first time the FAIR principles. And when we're talking about the FAIR principles, we're talking about those four letters, F-A-I-R. So when we're describing that, the first issue is findability, that the data are findable through systematic and clear metadata, and that those metadata themselves are systematically discoverable, and the existence of data is easily found. That the data are accessible, Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be accessible without restriction or control or governance. It does mean that there needs to be information about how those data can be accessed, if they can be accessed, and as we'll discuss in just a second, under what terms those data may be accessed. But this is also part of the FIND guidelines or principles or FAIR principles, is that the metadata, the documentation, are also available. That the data and metadata or documentation are also interoperable, that they're based on open standards that allow for reliable harvesting and reading and use of those metadata to facilitate the discovery of the existence and potentially enable access to those data. And finally, that those data and documentation be reusable, that the terms and restrictions and rights and responsibilities of folks that are interacting with those data and documentation know what their rights and responsibilities are, and that they be provided in forms that maximize their usability, that they're compatible with the common tools and technologies that folks are using to try to interact with data that they are encountering or hoping to be able to use in their research. And it's important to note here that the FAIR principles were largely created to address research data, but they certainly can be applied much more broadly. Today, we find ourselves really awash in data. We are surrounded by this vast volume. The FAIR principles are really an effort to try to maximize reusability of data, starting with the creation of data, but ultimately transitioning to a point where we can use our computational tools, our search engines, and other technologies to facilitate discovery, access, and reuse of the data so that we can continue this cycle of use, creation of new knowledge, contributing to that knowledge, sharing that knowledge, and moving on. And we come back to this core idea and need for documentation. Documentation that supports discovery, that's part of that findability, but also the understanding and use of data so that they can be assessed as to whether or not they are appropriate for a particular use, and that they have sufficient documentation that they actually can be effectively used. So with that, I want to talk about some resources and sources of data at different levels, because what we really want to do is to be able to take advantage of the outcomes of this thinking about FAIR and even predecessor activities to focus on the availability of data that can impact decision-making on the landscape, development of policy, transparency of decision-making, all of those things through shared data. So we can start with some of the common federal sources, whether they're coming out of NASA's network of distributed active archives, the USGS network of land data, water resource data, NOAA's weather and climate data, or data.gov, a consolidated resource for a vast array of largely federal, but there are a number of state and local agencies that also have elements in data.gov. I wanted to come back to ARGIS, especially for folks that are doing work here in New Mexico, as an excellent resource for geospatial and environmental data that is available through a fairly efficient interface for being able to discover those and access those data, both in formats that can be used within geographic information systems, but also in other analysis tools. So I would definitely recommend checking out ARGIS when you're looking for data, especially for New Mexico. Then finally, there's a broader landscape of data resources out there that have been emerging more recently, whether it's, and this is something that we wouldn't necessarily been talking about just a few years ago, but Google has gotten in the business of more systematically capturing and representing information about data sets that are out in the world. But there's also a proliferation of data repositories for particular disciplines, registered here as an example in re3data.org, or general purpose repositories like Dryad and our digital repository at the University of New Mexico that are both more general collections of material, but they're great resources when you're looking for materials to support your practices on the land or elsewhere. Finally, I wanted to focus on some dimensions of building skills, because data by themselves really aren't that helpful. And this is where training programs like those developed by the Carpentries, workshops that we offer through our Research Data Services program here in the university libraries, our clearinghouse managed by the Earth Science Information Partners. Thank you, Andrew, for the shout out for the recent work that's being done in ESIP around the care and the FAIR principles. We also have been developing a collection of now over 500 training resources that are available for largely free access for building data skills. And then I'd be remiss in not highlighting the opportunities to build knowledge and skills in specifically using geographic information systems. And a resource I often point folks to is the Introduction to GS provided by QGIS, the open source geographic information system that can run on pretty much any of the operating systems you might be using. It's free to use, and it provides tools so you can learn how to use GIS without having to climb a steep learning curve or have access to sometimes costly GIS licenses. So I just wanted to close by highlighting that the combination of care as a set of foundational values combined with the FAIR principles and the knowledge and skills on how to work with data practitioners in our interactions with each other and the interaction with the land. And with that, I'll hand it off to our next presenter, and we'll be happy to take some questions when we get to that point.
Great, thanks, Karl. I do see a really intriguing question about if there are contradictions between FAIR and CARE principles. And so I think that can be a topic of great discussion at the end. The other piece that I hope we get to talk about at the end is when and where do we not need data to make decisions? When are there other values that can supersede monitoring or data? You know, this whole webinar we've been talking about why we want to monitor, how we do it well, how we use it to connect people. But I think just going to preface that I think an interesting topic of conversation is when is that not giving us the highest societal benefit and when is that appropriate? Who leads the way, who makes those decisions are really important for ranchers, farmers, the people who are supporting them, people who are managing information, and all the rest. So thanks for those questions. Again, we're getting to some sticky, real topics, and yeah, look forward to having a nice conversation, respectful, and all of that later on. But as I said, we are gonna not give short shrift to our last speaker, and I scrolled up on my screen. So we've got Jared Talley from Boise State coming up next. Really excited to hear from him, has been working on environmental policy and natural resource management for a long time, as well as we think that he's sitting in the governor's office right at the moment. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Jared. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I am sitting in the governor's office at the moment here in the state of Idaho, where I do part of my work. I am also at BSU. Oh, I've got to get to presenter mode. There we go. You see this? Thank you for having me. I'm at Boise State University. I'm actually a philosopher, and you'll see some of that coming out in this presentation. when I think about this stuff, I try to put it in bigger contexts. And we're going to be talking about democracy here a little bit. And, but a lot of my role is actually just running collaborations around the state and the West itself, and helping people think through collaboration. And that's why I'm sitting in the governor's office right now. So I'm going to call this Rangeland Monitoring Hidden Challenges for Community-Based Monitoring. And we're going to start out with just thinking about the definition of monitoring, period. There's two that I think are really useful here. One is to watch, keep track of, or check usually, or I don't know what usually means there, but check usually for a special purpose. The other is the periodic observation of a phenomenon. And as I look at this definition, there's a few things that pop out to me. And this kind of goes back to your question that you just posed right there before I started talking. When we say to watch or keep track of it, it demands that we ask who is watching and keeping track of. And then how are they doing it? And this for a special purpose demands why. And when I start to ask these questions and figure out answers to them, I bring myself back to bigger kind of topics in democracy writ large. And I go back to history to see how to situate monitoring that we do on the ground now within a bigger discourse. So I want to tell a story going back to the 1920s about a debate between these two gentlemen, Walter Lippman and John Dewey. Walter, well, let me put some context here. They were having a problem trying to figure out what democracy looks like in a rapidly industrialized society. When society is getting really complex really quickly, they were thinking, how do we expect the public to be informed enough about the complexities of society in order to make informed decisions? That was fundamentally, they agree on the problem, but they disagree on the solution. Walter Lippmann famously says, well, the public cannot actually reasonably be expected to be entirely informed on all the problems that they actually face in this complex industrial society. So we should trust the experts. Expert proxies for the public should be the ones making decisions and so they make decisions for the public and the public good. And John Dewey famously said in 1927, his publication of Public and Its Problems said, oh, no, that's not the way to go. We need to have dedicated education and information and let the public be involved in the solutions to their own problems. John Dewey, a lot of you might recognize him as kind of the father of modern education. He basically founded what we consider public education right now for this reason. But these are two very divergent conceptions of democracy. One says democracy is best held through expert proxies. The other is through community engagement. And I want to think through these divergences in the role of rangeland monitoring today. But I have one more story to tell before we do that, and it's about shovels. In the 40s and 50s, and this is another story about industrial intensification, Frederick Winslow Taylor was an engineer looking at industrial processes and said, you know, I think we can make them more efficient. He noticed some people were shoveling heavy loads and were exhausted at the end of the day. Some people were shoveling light loads and were not exhausted at the end of the day. And he set out to find the perfect shovel and he did this scientifically. He collected a lot of data, measured time, measured energy levels, trying to figure out what the perfect shovel was. And in fact, he found 8 shovels that, depending on what you were shoveling, is what you would use. And he actually says that 21 pounds is the exact right amount to be shoveling, so you could work an 8-hour day, days in and days out. But really the point of this here is this falls out of this progressive era scientific management. In fact, Frederick Winslow Taylor is the father of what's called scientific management, which underwrites our environmental policy and natural resource management to this day. And what this basically says is if we dedicate enough thought and we do enough rigorous experimentation around these processes, we can find the perfect fill in the blank. He's talking about shovels in this specific instance, but we see this a lot now with the perfect monitoring method or the perfect shovel. We just need more of the most rigorous validated science. We can find the right way to do it, and then that's what we'll use. But this comes out of this kind of Lippmanian Walter Lippmann expert proxy, because of course, the community oftentimes doesn't have the resources to do these sorts of research. So another sort of governance that challenges this progressive error management is called pragmatic governance or pragmatic management. This has been on the scene for about 40 years, and it kind of flips that on the head, saying you don't actually need the perfect shovel. You just need a shovel that does the job. And I know this is simplifying this too much, but if we have a group together, and this comes from the Dewey community sense, if we have a group that says, here's the problem we have, they agree on the problem, and then they try to figure out what do we need to observe to figure out how the changes we make are impacting the problem or not. If we agree to that, let's agree, let's put it into action, and then we'll make a change the next season or the next year if we're not seeing what we want. We keep doing that. That's the pragmatic management. The idea of a perfect shovel doesn't exist in pragmatic management. It recognizes that every community is going to be different. Every need is going to be different. The goals, the objectives, they're all going to be different. And there is no perfect shovel. Instead, the shovel is a work in progress, and it changes through those needs, through community discourse. And that challenges the sort of expert proxy. It puts the public square in the line of solving their own problems. So we've got these two stories, but I want to bring it back down to the ground regarding rangeland monitoring specifically. And we don't often talk about this, but we actually monitor for two different reasons. A lot of the monitoring is done for policy. It's to make policy. But monitoring for policy, it requires some different conditions here. We're spanning decades because we don't make a policy every 6 months or every 3 months or as the seasons change. When we make a policy, we expect it to last. When we write a land use plan, we expect it to last over multiple seasons and potentially even generations. But also it spans different landscapes. We don't write policy on a particular acre. We write policy that governs whole landscapes. And of course, all of this is an umbrella over multiple different contexts, whether that be rural and urban, recreation and ranching, mountaintop versus desert valley. The contexts are so different, but we have policies that overarch all of them. Policy, when we're doing monitoring for policy, we're really risk and failure averse. We're trying to get it right. Think about this shovel. We're trying to have the best perfect shovel to get it right. We do not want to get it wrong. And a lot of this is just we don't want to be held up in court. I think we all have in our careers at some point heard about the impacts of litigation on doing some of the work on the ground. And in order to not be litigated, we have to be very averse to trying something new. We want guaranteed results. These guaranteed results are part of the scientific management. We want valid, rigorous data collection that's used for prediction and control. We want to predict what's going to happen in the future. Therefore, we can control what's going to happen. And that's what we're doing with our policy. And this comes in to controlled experimentation. This requires experts. Monitoring for policy is a very Walter Lippmann monitoring, expert proxy sort of monitoring. But we also sometimes monitor for management. Now, monitoring for management is very different. It's particular to a season. When we're actually on the ground monitoring, we're trying to figure out how a change we make is going to impact this ground in 3 months or next year. We're not thinking about decades, although we might be in some sense, but we're also thinking about the very short time frame. We're monitoring for particular sites. What happens when I change my management here in this site, not across the entire landscape? We can do that. We can capture that differently. And it's particular to a specific context. It's particular to a specific, let's say, grazing management strategy or a particular land use plan, something of that nature. Monitoring for management is actually, they accept risk and failure. That's part of the process. Because there's no perfect shovel, the shovel is a work in progress. Risk and failure are informative. We develop the shovel the best we possibly can. We go use it. It didn't work. Let's try a new shovel. And we keep doing that till we get the best shovel for the particular season, site, and context. We don't need valid data. We need reliable data. And it's not for prediction and control, it's for guidance and change. We're not trying to predict and control. We're trying to use the information we gather from our imperfect shovel to guide our management and change it in light of changing circumstances. And this is a different sort of experimentation. It's broad experimentation. It's something like I might, if I'm trying to figure out what the perfect grilled cheese for me is, what grilled cheese I love, I might experiment with different cheeses, but it's not valid. It's not rigorous. It doesn't go through scientific testing. It's interlaced with values. And that we shouldn't be afraid of broad experimentation in monitoring for management in collaborative community settings. It doesn't need to be rigorous in order to be useful. This is pragmatic management versus scientific management. And so there's some stories that I'm telling here to kind of contextualize monitoring in a bigger picture. We have monitoring for policy and monitoring for management. These are the same lists that we just kind of discussed. These are apples and oranges, and we don't often have these conversations in especially collaborative spaces. What is the use? What is the situation, the why of our monitoring? Is it for policy or for management? And especially when we start seeing right now with federal agencies, they're having a hard time getting staff. We know they're understaffed and they're underfunded. They can oftentimes only support certain monitoring strategies, and they will oftentimes go for policy. But monitoring for policy is not super helpful for monitoring for management because they're two very, very different things that rest on very different conceptual foundations. So we want to bring the community, if we want to bring the community into this in a kind of John Dewey community pragmatic sense, we need to really consider different processes for monitoring for management. This is where cooperative monitoring agreements are coming into play with both the BLM and the Forest Service. And they're helping. We're getting closer to that, but without having this conversation about the difference between policy and management, I'm seeing in my experience in my work that oftentimes these CMAs are still monitoring for policy. That's what they're recommending, when what we need to be is monitoring for management. So these are the two stories I've told. On one side, we have Walter Lippman talking about a theory of democracy that puts expert proxies at the lead. These expert proxies use valid and rigorous scientific management to figure out the perfect shovel or suite of shovels that we can use given our situation. Depending on my situation, I go find the shovel, and then we write that into policy. The policy says, here's the shovel to use given your situation. But a different story here, and there's not a right or wrong here. Actually, these are both useful for different reasons. The different story is John Dewey saying, no, the public needs to be involved. The community needs to be involved in their own affairs, solving their own problems. But to do that, because the community often doesn't have the scientific expertise that scientific management requires, we require a different governance strategy, this pragmatic governance where we get rid of the ideal of a perfect shovel and instead accept failure and risk as part of the process as informative, so we can continually develop a new shovel in light of changing circumstances. This requires the community to be part of. So I want to just take us back to this slide, the who, the how, and the why. The who can be answered two different ways. The who is it the experts doing the monitoring or controlling the methodology and the measurement of the monitoring itself? The how, or is it the community that's involved in developing the practices? The how, it could be the scientific management monitoring for policy or the pragmatic management monitoring for management. And then the why, of course, is this policy versus management, but also to a bigger point is which form of democracy are we supporting or are we adhering to, depending on the practices that we're recommending in our policy. And that gets me to a bigger point about policy. And I work, my own work is on federal public lands, the majority of it is, or state public lands. So I work with policy surrounding monitoring quite a bit. And I always ask this question, is this a prescriptive policy or a permissive policy? And I'll talk real quick about what these are. Prescriptive policies fall out of the scientific management expert proxy sense. It's saying the policy prescribes what you need to do. And the policy has been written based on the most valid and rigorous scientific management, which is wonderful. But if it's prescriptive, it doesn't give the room for the community to have that pragmatic, there is no perfect shovel, we're going to fail, let's experiment. Permissive policy is a different policy orientation where we have policies that guide the process, but they don't tell you which shovel to use. They just guide the process on developing the shovel. So these policies are flexible. They have a broader definition of experimentation that isn't narrowly defined as rigorous and scientifically validated. Just like the grilled cheese example, we can experiment that doesn't necessarily make it into papers, but are nonetheless informative. And if we do it as a group, it can be very helpful for our practices. So when I'm looking at a policy regarding monitoring, these are the questions I'm asking based on what our goals and objectives are. So the upshot of this all is if we want to have community being engaged in monitoring, we need to be thinking about this monitoring for management, pragmatic governance side of it, not the monitoring for policy, scientific management side of it. If that's what we want, we need flexible methods, flexible measures, and flexible policies. We need to be able to experiment in this broad sense out on the landscape with different practices and different management techniques and see what works and what doesn't, because what works up here in Idaho may not and probably will not work in New Mexico. And that's fine, and we should understand that. Observation is critical here. Observation is common between scientific management and pragmatic management. But what's more uncommon is a word that I didn't put in front of observation is qualitative observation, not necessarily quantitative observation. Sometimes pictures, sometimes people's experiences out on the field are enough for pragmatic management, but they are not enough for scientific management. So we gotta broaden again what we consider as useful data, and maybe this gets back to the question that was posed right before I started talking, about what sort of observations are necessary depending on the type of monitoring we're doing. We got to think about empowering the community to take control of or be a part, of defining the problem and using the metaphor of the shovel, helping to create the right shovel. But this isn't just the community out on the land. This needs to be done with government partners, NGO partners, community in a broad sense, meaning not only the ones maybe doing the grazing management on the land, but also other impacted and affected communities. It needs to be plural. And what I mean by plural is, again, going back to the metaphor of the shovel, it's not a one shovel will answer our problems, the perfect shovel. We need to understand in a very deep, almost metaphysical sense that there are many, many shovels that will work depending on the problem that's at hand. And if we co-define that problem in collaboration, then we can hopefully be sure that multiple values are represented in the shovel answer, the solution that we come up with. So I'm going to end it there. I went a little quick, but I want to keep us on time. Basically, what I'm trying to do is contextualize our monitoring practices within these bigger discourses of democracy and governance, and give us some language to articulate in our collaborative spaces the difference between monitoring for policy and monitoring for management, and how that impacts the way that we set up our monitoring protocols. So at that, I will turn it back over, and then we can just do some Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much. Let's see, I think, there we go. Thank you so much, speakers. That was fantastic. We had met ahead of time, having some idea of what you all would talk about, and that was just wonderful. I'm going to head back over to the chat and get some of the early questions answered. Please do feel free to keep adding. While people are thinking about the chat, I just dropped a Google form that gives us an evaluation of this workshop. We can share that out with our partners, and it helps us continue to improve the offerings out to you all. So it should take you less than 2 minutes. It makes a huge difference to us. So please do use that evaluation to give us some feedback. But back to the topic, we had some calls for case studies. So I think maybe if I can put everyone on the spot, and maybe a case study for CARES, a case study for FAIR, and then Jared, if you can think of a case study. Does anyone want to begin with an idea that they can root into, get their teeth into?
May I raise my hand? Or I'm sorry, I'm a little bit behind.
I can provide a case study if you need.
That'd be great.
Yeah, I've been doing some work for the past 7 years with the Cottonwood Ranch in A.G. Smith. I think a lot of you know him, in northeastern Nevada, working on some monitoring protocols and cooperative monitoring agreements with the Forest Service. And we've had a lot of problem, and this is actually part of why I've been researching this difference between monitoring for policy and monitoring for management, of coming to agreement in collaboration on how to monitor and what we're monitoring for. Part of it is that they don't have money, right? They don't have money and time. So when they want the community to come in and do some cooperative monitoring, they're thinking they want the monitoring to inform policy. And what that means is we need randomized sites, right? So that they can be scientifically valid. Whereas for management, we're choosing the sites. Like, this is the site that we need to be monitoring because this is where my management is impacting. But that doesn't work for scientific validity in some of the monitoring protocols. And Forest Service was demanding randomized sites, which of course didn't work for the management. The protocols, some of them were pretty technical, and they required credentialed expertise from the community in order to carry out. And so if someone didn't have the right degree, then they couldn't actually carry out the measure. And so of course the community can't be involved then they're in the monitoring practice itself, which gave rise to, okay, what are some different methods that we can use to capture the relevant information that we need that the community can be involved in, can take out in the saddlebag, and when they're out there moving cows, jump off and do a Brix test on the plant near riparian zone to see what their sugar levels are. What does that indicate? It may not be scientific valid, but it might indicate something that might change our management. And figure out how to write this up into the CMA. And it's been an ongoing process, and we're actually still working with it. We have not yet, after 3 years, got a cooperative monitoring agreement on the ground because of these deep-seated disagreements in the role between the experts and the publics, monitoring for policy, monitoring for management, the measures and the sorts of data that we're observing and using for our different projects. So.
That's super helpful. And I think, yes, that sounds frustrating that it's taken 3 years. And then on the other hand, it's like, you know, if there's things that are really important, it's a nice example of things not being rushed. So that's great. Andrew or Karl, do you want to offer a case study, either of you?
I could jump in. This is now somewhat dated, but it is an illustration of even some of these early principles in practice. And I just pasted a link in the chat. This is a paper that a number of us presented at the Applied Geography Conference back in 2006 about a collaborative project that we were working on with Bob Parmenter for the Valles Caldera National Reserve. And we were working with Bob and folks in the Earth and Planetary Sciences to develop a process for acquiring near real-time satellite imagery, and then using a statistical model that Bob Parmenter developed for being able to estimate essentially biomass for the grazing areas in the Valle Caldera. And Bob was using this to provide near real-time assessment of the grazing regions within the Valle to help inform their decision-making in terms of moving the livestock around within the Valle Caldera. And it was a really interesting exercise in in this case, taking publicly available remote sensing data being produced by NASA, which were not in terribly user-friendly forms, especially at that point, and converting them into both data that could be downloaded and associated services that allowed us to very easily provide current information in an interactive web browser environment, so that Bob, in support of the work that they were doing in the Valle Caldera, could access this near real-time information for their grazing areas and have that inform their decision-making, but do so in a way that required little or no additional processing or sort of heavy lifting around the use and reuse of those data, and also made it easier to communicate the dynamics of the landscape in a very interactive and visual way. And so this is an illustration of some of those principles of interoperability and reusability and access to data products that have actually been around as principles, especially in geospatial data, long before the FAIR principles, but the FAIR principles have really crystallized the value of these principles more broadly across other categories of data beyond where they had already been developing pretty strongly in geospatial data.
That's great. I'm going to turn it over to Andrew if you have a case study, and if not, might kick it over to the contradictions to FAIR and CARE and give you a chance to start. But I'll start with if you have a case study that you'd like to offer.
No case studies as of right now, just relating back directly to CARE, mostly because they were published in 2019. We all know what happened in 2020, so it's been a lot of Zoom calls and meetings and advocacy via the internet. But we're at the point where we're having these conversations, introducing them to folks, obviously talk about rangeland monitoring. So if anyone's interested in developing a case study and working towards something, applying the CARES principles to see what that could look like, not only just in indigenous populations, but in rural populations, because there is overlap, definitely let's talk. Let's see what we can get going to see how it could be applied and what it could look like. Obviously address the challenges. And that's a lot of what we've been doing since 2015 on, is looking at and identifying the gaps in what's there right now. I would say the CARES principles came out of sort of a pushback against the open data movement there, where obviously, and this kind of ties into the question about the conflict or contradiction between FAIR and CARE, relating back to the open data movement. We have legacy data sets that involve indigenous peoples that can be out, but don't actually mention us, don't mention our populations, our peoples. And so legacy data sets and repositories now being shared in open data spaces continues that historical erasure of our peoples on the lands as well. And so we need to address that. So that's one contradiction that I can mention between FAIR and CARE. Well, not necessarily between FAIR, but as part of like it's the accessible, there's a little bit of pushback. There's like with permissions along with FAIR. I can see Karl shaking his head there. So
yeah, and I think that's a really good point, that it's both awareness moving forward and there's awareness retrospectively, that it's like things aren't going to change if we just start now and implement CARE and FAIR, or either way, that there is also the devoting the time and energy and resources to move back through time and what is freely available now or not freely available now, and like having really a lot of mindfulness of what exists already. That's great. Karl, you were nodding. Did you jump in for?
Sure, and I think this potential for conflict, I think it exists, but I think it also is potentially an overlay on FAIR or a conflation of maybe we could call it the strong open data perspective as an overlay on the fair principles, where the fair principles themselves, and it's interesting because I'm involved in the International Group on Earth Observation, which has its Earth Observations, which has its own set of data sharing and data management principles. And the discussions going on in GEO are actually that the FAIR principles are too restrictive in terms of open data, where GEO is really focused on, in its core and initial data sharing principles, really focused on the absolute openness as the objective for especially the Earth observation data that are the principal focus of the GEO community members. But so it's interesting. We can all sort of look at the FAIR principles through our particular lens, and FAIR principles can certainly be and are a good enabler of open data, but they don't necessarily require open data. And that's, I think, where the intersection between the CARE principles as a set of values that define, how data should be governed, who has access and control, who benefits from access to and sharing of those data, can then serve to, exactly, Eva, as you described earlier, then inform what your strategy is for trying to be fair around those data while still honoring those initial principles.
Right. I just wanted to take a moment because we've gotten pretty deep into sort of information management, and I'm jumping away from the questions from the audience, but I think there's a piece of this that if you are doing things like writing a data management plan for a grant, you probably already know that that's something that is in your wheelhouse. But for folks who are not writing data management plans as part of their job, I would love to hear from each of you of like what we just talked about, how having this mindfulness of these different considerations, how can that affect people's sort of everyday life? If you're a rancher moving through your landscape, or if you work for the Forest Service and you're thinking about a new lease, something like that. So I would love to hear from each of you on zooming way out, what you see would be beneficial. Like, what do you want just any person to take away from your presentation?
I could maybe jump in first, as I spent in my day job here at UNM, I tend to live, eat, and breathe data management planning. And one of the first principles in any of our conversations, primarily with researchers, is talking about what data and information they need. What are the data resources that they're tapping into? And I would cast that more broadly in terms of information resources beyond just data, as we might think of it as tables of values or geographic data that we might pull into a geographic information system. Because once we understand what information and data we need, then we can start developing a strategy for how are we going to get that? How are we going to organize it? How are we going to leverage it to make decisions? How are we going to effectively share and communicate either those data or the products of our use of those data to others? Basically, how do we create an impact? And that starts with just that process of what is the information I need and where can I get it? How do I organize and synthesize it? How do I use it to answer the questions I have? And that's the core of 90% of the data management planning that we talk with researchers about, but I think can be applied much more broadly.
maybe I can jump in real quick. I kind of mentioned it the last of my presentation, but we have a lot of information about how to do monitoring and what are the best methods, and if we're interested in this thing, how do we capture that thing? That's why I didn't talk about any of that, because we know we can do that fairly easily. I think one of the big things I wanted to show in my presentation, or to help, is to give language to people in collaborative space to say, wait a second, what you're asking me is this, and what I need is this other thing. And if we don't have that language, if we don't understand that the word monitoring or the word experimentation actually gets interpreted in multiple different ways, and if we're not having a discussion about those multiple interpretations, then oftentimes we waste time and resources, and we get frustrated, and collaborations take 3 years to do something, or something of that nature. And so just providing language to help us have these discussions within a collaborative space, I think is my big takeaway.
I think it definitely comes down to the foundation of understanding language, speaking the same language. My wife's a pedologist and she works with hydrologists, and obviously nonstop. So even when I go back home and tell my family about what I do for a living, I need to clarify X, Y, and Z to make sure they understand. And that's like a big part of the work that I do, is like, does it really matter what I do if I can't communicate that to my community back home? If I say I'm doing work for Indigenous communities or with Indigenous communities, like, I have to hold myself accountable there. But having that same language and setting that foundation and then moving projects forward is definitely important. And I think that's part of what the CARE principles gets back to, is the relationships that develop throughout that process. And specifically with researchers, those relationships begin before the funding call goes out. It's just, getting to know the folks whose lands you're on. The U of A, being a land grant institution, does a lot of work with Tonatham and then Pasquayaki as well, and is working to build those relationships, support students on campus, and move forward that way. So definitely language is very important, understanding what everyone's talking about, making sure everyone's coming from the same base and perspective as well.
Thanks so much, everyone. I would love for folks to be able to stay on, but I understand we're at our hour and a half. So if you have to jump off, I'm going to do one more call, scroll up in the chat, and do fill out our evaluation form while it's still fresh in your mind. And for folks who can stay, we're going to stay on and chat. And if you have to leave, thank you so much for spending spending your lunch hour with us. But yeah, I'm going to go back to the chat unless somebody had something off of those takeaways. I think there was you bring up a great point from Karl. Oh, there's things happening in the chat. Let me see. Where are we? Let's see. So we had Rich, we had a community-centered study design is critical for long-term connection, stewardship, reflection based on the results. And then tending the neighborhood, collective open spaces and shared watersheds. Yeah, that's great. And we got there's no one size fits all approach. I think these are referencing things that were happening. We've got, oh great, thanks Rich for dropping in a cool study design process. Excellent. Did you want to come off mute and talk about that for just a second?
Sure, can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I've been, Barb Horn, who's in Durango, awesome mentor. She's retired, but she's created Colorado River Watch, but also is a nationwide leader in study design for communities, tribes. I learned from her, and I've been doing this study design process, Pickery's Pueblo for their 106 program, and so having it driven by, I love what everybody said, Andrew and Jared and Karl, a lot driven by values. That's the starting point. And particularly, bringing in people with traditional knowledge too, not just the experts. And that really begins to drive a kind of a community-centered process. So I have experience in that and still love to do that. you know, and so that guidance that you saw in there, that little PowerPoint, is really a distillation of a really pretty finely tuned machine for doing this iterative planning process around data management. Why are you doing it though? That's the beginning one. So thanks for everybody sharing. Oh, I did want to say one other thing. There is data sovereignty. There are tools now for total data sovereignty that are being, I know a guy who's doing this. Some people might know him. The simtable.com, I'm going to just pop that in there. Stephen Guerin has a way of making this peer-to-peer, basically total sovereign system. So, and it's not stored on one server, which is kind of cool.
Great. Thanks for sharing, Rich. Bre has a question about validity of expert versus public observation. Why is citizen science, or now there's movement to call it community science, valid in some disciplines and not others? And some communities are involved and not others. So community birders seem to be recognized generally as experts. Community ranchers and land stewards are not. There are folks that want to respond to that.
I can jump in here. Thanks, Bre, for a big question. I think the answers are just as big and frustrating as, and there are no real solutions. I think part of it is the history of conservation in the U.S. has prioritized nature over what oftentimes has been called extractive use, but the use of the land instead of the preservation of the land. And I think there is still some just bias there on trusting which communities have good data and which don't. Those same bias exist in different disciplines for different reasons. But also, you know, we got to recognize that all data can be valid data, depending on the extrapolation. What you say on the data makes it either valid or not. So you can take any data point and say something, and it might not be a valid consequence of the data. But if you do it right, and right, I'm going to put in quotation marks, then it can be a valid consequence of the data. And I think part of that is that management versus policy. A lot of people, stewards, land stewards, ranchers, people on the land, are collecting data for an entirely different purpose than valid sort of scientific discovery. And it just doesn't work for that. And we're scared of it in some sense, like, oh no, we need scientifically valid data, but there is a role for it. And we just need, as a broader community, to start recognizing that role for it and how to prioritize that over just the scientifically valid data.
I might jump in as well as the challenge and historic devaluation of qualitative as opposed to quantitative data, where, you know, for so long, you know, the things that count are the things that could be counted. And if it's not something that you're measuring with an instrument or you know, otherwise quantifying in a way that is sort of the traditional Western scientific approach, then that you know, those insights, those observations are devalued, and that is, I think, part of the legacy of the different weight that's applied to different sources of you know, truth, with giant air quotes, in terms of scientific or other policy knowledge.
Great. So we had a couple of questions. Catherine, are you seeing a movement to monitoring for management along with or instead of monitoring for policy? There's the EU ag policy. There's much more measurement of the performance of soils versus of the practices employed. For example, the level of bare ground instead of practice. Yeah, are you seeing a movement towards or away from either of those?
I'll say yes, definitely, absolutely. There is a huge movement for monitoring for management, even if we're not calling it that. That's and part of the wanting to supply some language. I also think that's part of where a lot of the frustrations in collaboration with federal agencies are coming from. There's a movement to monitoring for management, but the policies are not there to allow that monitoring for management to really occur on a broad scale. And that's where a lot of these frustrations are coming from, that no, federal agencies are saying, no, this is the sort of monitoring we need because they're monitoring for policy. And then there's this huge movement saying, no, this is the sort of monitoring we need because they're monitoring for management. Those are two very different things that have different conceptions of democracy and governance underwriting them. And without having this broader discussion at a policy level, that permissive policy versus just prescriptive policy, we're likely to continue running into these frustrations for a very long time. But yeah, you're right, Catherine, there is a very large movement to monitoring for management.
I think some of that may be coming from the Fourth National Assessment on Climate Change. And over again, when we talk about adaptive management and monitoring, it's all about making it more frequent and making it more meaningful so that we can practice adaptive management and use the monitoring to inform more of an in the field pivoting or supporting decision making instead of the long-term policy thing that you're.
Exactly right, yeah.
Great. There was another point, it was addressed to Jared, but I think this points to something that all of you have talked about. There are different parts of the data management cycle, and Jared, you brought up education as part of that data management system. And so maybe just, I'll start with Jared, since that was who the question was for. How does education figure into management versus policy? But I'm going to just broaden it up for all of our speakers of everyone has talked about the need to communicate and be really clear. And so maybe broadly, how does education fit into that as part of these data management principles and data management cycles?
Again, asking the big questions, I love it. There is a difference, at least in how I view it, in formal education versus non-formal education. And the answer to that question, I think, changes depending on which one we're talking about. If we're talking about formal education, then, of course, just having broadly the monitoring for policy versus monitoring for management and the different kind of conditions that each require being taught and the differences between them, I think would be great. But the informal education, I think, is more important. And in fact, John Dewey, going back to what I was talking about democracy, being the father of education, he actually thought that education in this informal sense was democracy. And not the formal education, not talking about going to university, but to continually being informed and educated about our lives and the things that we face and the problems we face was the heart of what a good democracy was. And I think that monitoring for management is just that. It's having a rancher on the land, learning how their practices are impacting the land, changing their practices and learning again and co-learning as a group is that education. And I think that's in some sense, the central component of this monitoring for management is this big educative, informative process where there is no end. There is no end to our education. There is no perfect shovel, I guess. It's just a consistent process, an educative process.
Definitely having the right tool for the job. Not trying to paint with a hammer or anything like that. Yeah, formal, informal education in relation to the CARES principles. So as a Native academic speaking to various audiences, some tribal folks are on the call sometimes, and sometimes it's strictly academic or maybe just conference. And bringing that formal education forward, having these discussions, and going back, as I said before, to the communities, going back to my reservation, folks who never left, who understand the community so much more at such a granular level than I have, who, you know, left and went and, you know, built a life outside of the community. So coming back and forth and working together to build any sort of policy, not just relating back to monitoring, but that's what we're focused on here, can be useful and beneficial. But I would say from our end, as far as education, it's incumbent upon us as Indigenous academics, Indigenous scholars, to be quiet and listen when we go back to our communities, and to show that respect, because there's an education that happens in community that we are not a part of. And it's not upon us, it's not part of us to come back and wield our degrees over our peoples. So using the care principles and talking about care principles and bringing this conversation back to some of those points, talking about governance, talking about inclusion, talking about historical issues, citizen engagement within the collective benefit portions, and ethics. Like, you can always start a conversation on the ethics and understand, and it goes back to the language, like defining what's valid. Who's defining what's valid? Is it the folks who are coming from out of the community? Or is it the folks who are coming from the community that you're looking to partner with or work with?
And yeah, I would add that back to this sort of formal versus informal learning approach. This is where we've been seeing the incredible value of those more informal learning opportunities, because they give us a lot of flexibility in terms of working with the learners that we're supporting to align our approach and our content. So this is, you know, whether it's the workshops that we've been developing locally within the library for some of the data science practices, it's when we're designing and setting up our longer form software or data carpentry workshops. The first step of that is actually talking to the local organizers that we're working with to try to figure out, you know, what are the needs, what are the skills, where can we have the greatest impact? But this is all starting at the you know, typically at the novice level. It's being able to bring folks from the point where they don't know what they don't know, but we can bring them up over that first step, so that at least they can have a starting point for what is often a continued self-education pathway. And that's proven to be a really valuable approach for us.
That's great. This is, yeah, there's so many aspects of all of this. Oh, go Bre, did you want to say something?
Oh, I have a question for consideration. Because I feel like, you know, Jared bringing up like monitoring for policy, monitoring for management. We haven't talked about monitoring for markets, and that essentially, you know, whether it's monitoring or data mining for markets and how that plays into this. And, you know, is big data and broad information sharing really in service to people in communities, or is it just in service to corporations? And so how do we balance that knowing that there are market opportunities that rural communities should have access to through our data, but then balancing, you know, how do we balance that, I guess, with the monitoring for management, the monitoring for market access, all that? What are your guys' thoughts?
Well, Bre, as a longtime collaborator of yours, I am showing right now me learning and being educated and thinking, because you've just blown up. I think you're exactly right. That is a third category that we're seeing more and more. And I don't have actually a thought on it. I have to think a lot more about it. But you're right that monitoring for markets is a different beast. And I don't know that we actually have systems that are even tooled for that, at least in the context of range management right now. But I know you're working on that a lot, so I'm definitely looking forward to learning from you.
Yeah, and your point is also a good one in terms of the information asymmetry that exists between, the large, corporate interests and, folks that are working on the ground, and having access to the data, and even having the data available in alignment with the FAIR principles does not by default make those data usable or contribute to equal beneficial use of those data. And that's where capacity building within communities to be able to do that, to be able to first have access to the same data and information that others have access to, but then being in a position to actually use it to serve their interests and values, is that back to that point about education and technical capacity.
I would say for myself, this is something that we haven't ever touched on, at least in my conversations with CARES. And so you really opened up a lot of questions in my head on that topic, because there are a lot of tribes in the US that do use environmental tourism, and what that could look like based off starting that conversation, asking those questions, monitoring on the landscapes for the continuation of markets and bringing people onto the rest, increase revenues for tribal government. So yeah, great question, Bre.
Bre wins the webinar.
Well, I'm glad that you guys feel that way. I would love to have some follow-up conversation, because it very much relates to some things that we're working on at WLA and with other partners, and so having your guys' input into that conversation would be really meaningful.
There's also a great comment from Brooke of this more iterative framework of how we treat data really gets down to local scales, that there, there's a lot that can be pulled from satellites and everything, but that the learning and implementation at these really local, and that brings us right back to the whole point of having these conversations helps us connect. It's like, some of the most fun times, you pull up to a ranch and you look at the big map and everyone is looking at the same map, and things like that are just such beautiful and meaningful ways to start connecting with people. We're already over time, so there's no rush, but I think we're through the chat, so feel free, the 15 or so of us remaining, feel free to come off chat and make comments. If we need to, we can stop the recording. So just come on out and ask questions. I'll give people, I'll count to 10 in my head. Go ahead, Jared.
I have something I might say real quick, that because we've been talking so much about knowledge and education, something that I found is really helpful in the conversations I have in different collaboratives is thinking about knowledge not as a noun, but as a verb. And we're taught in our formal education that knowledge is a noun, like it's something you can possess. And when you possess it, it doesn't change. It's an object. And I think that's unhelpful. If we think about it as a process, as an action of gaining knowledge, this continual education that Brooke talked about, it's an action, and there's never an attainment. There's never an object you can get. It's a process that you will be in your entire life. I think it's been really helpful to talk about knowledge as a verb instead of a noun in the spaces I've been in.
That's why we should always have philosophers in our conversations.
Or not. I know a lot of older philosophers that I would not recommend.
Well, unfortunately, I have to drop off because I have to go present on a draft research data policy to our IT committee in a few minutes.
I'll thank you so much, speakers. You all have wrapped up this 4-session workshop, and we just so appreciate your time and your energy. Huge shout out to Western landowners for help. I saw that Brooke unmuted. Hopefully your question is not for Karl, and otherwise we can get you all connected. But thank you so much, Karl, and anyone else who has to drop off.
Thank you. This is great, and I look
Thanks,
forward
Karl.
to hearing more.
Go ahead, Brooke.
I'm also just popped off just to like say thank you to everybody presenting, and Jared specifically, just to the clarity and simplicity with which you described these two different ways of monitoring, and it is very helpful. And I like what you said about, like, that's pretty easy to do. Like, how do we actually get to the next step of, experiential knowledge on the ground, these sort of iterative things. And maybe just like the wannabe philosopher in me is like, wow, it's really nice to have like something very simply described that helps me with my paradigms or whatever. So thank you.
Thank you, Brooke. I appreciate that. That's very kind.
Like that mention of wannabe philosopher. That's good. I think we all have a little bit in us, and that's why it's so fun for me to talk to Jared, because it lets me elevate my wannabe philosopher. Like, we all have a little wannabe hippie in us, like, right, spectrum, y'all got it. Yeah. So
can I tell you a secret? I'm still a wannabe philosopher.
I have a question I wanted for Peter. Hoping you're still there, Peter. I'm curious with the soils app and how you see it relating to this conversation and the utility of it, and being in service to community. But I'm struggling with I know you guys, well, I don't actually know in terms of open source, who has access to it through the soils app, all those types of questions, and then what are kind of the analytical tools or capabilities of it for landowners then. And you touched on this a little bit last week, but we didn't get to spend too much time on it. So I'm curious how it relates to this conversation today.
Really quickly, thank you, Lawrence. And I've been saving the chat, and there have been a lot of resources shared in the chat, and so we'll get that out to everyone in a closing email. So thank you. Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Bre. I just wanted to follow up with Jared's wonderful distinction between monitoring for management and monitoring for policy, and the importance of knowledge as a verb. And for my upcoming book, this is a graphic I use quite a bit. The drawing hands thing, there's a feedback loop between knowing and doing, and there's a co-creative loop there. One doesn't cause the other in a linear way, but it's a co-creation, it's a co-production, it's a feedback loop, which unfortunately a lot of our science, a lot of our bureaucracy, a lot of our policy is still not adequate to. And yes, the work I've been involved in, the Soil Carbon Challenge for the last dozen years and so forth, and is one of the things I've worked on is this soilhealth.app, which is a platform for community monitoring for management. And even a lot of the people who are participating, who are using this platform, don't really understand the distinction that Jared so eloquently presented to us today. And they're still in the mindset of surveillance, of we need to use the indicators that the scientists tell us are valid, instead of asking our own questions. Soilhealth.app is designed to allow a group to ask its own questions, design its own forms. For sure, researchers can participate. It's got privacy controls, and I'm still working on that. Data can be either private to the group or public. And most of the data on soilhealth.app so far is private to the groups, because that's just the way it's for management more than policy. And I'm not sure I remember the rest of your question, Bre, but We don't have a subscription. I'm working with the Soil Carbon Coalition, which is a nonprofit on this, and we don't have a subscription model. Looking for partners to help develop it. And it can go in very many different ways. The structure is that there are projects within soilhealth.app. It's not open source, but it might be. The projects are individually configurable. You can use your own questions. I insist that there be a local coordinator or more than one who has administrative privileges for that project, because I'm not going to do it all. But there has to be local direction and control. And actually, that's been a little bit difficult to get that point across to people, because people are so used to surveillance monitoring, or so used to compliance monitoring, or so used to what Jared calls monitoring for policy. That's the default paradigm that we have. When you show up with a clipboard, that's what you're doing. That's what you must be doing.
Yeah. Within the data fields, there's the soil health piece. Is there date like management history, current management actions? Is there places already for that to be input as well? Or can it be developed?
It can be developed. Yeah, there's no, it's not a standard package of indicators with pre-designed forms.
Well, and I think that gets back to something that we has touched on a couple of times, is that who decides what to measure really matters for what answers you get. So who decides the question, who decides the methods, all of that. And that again comes back to, if you want meaningful data that connects people, it takes so much time and intention to reach out. It's a slower process than just grabbing a clipboard and being on your way. So we have held on to these speakers for 2 hours. We so appreciate your time. As I mentioned, there'll be a follow-up email with, we're going to compile the resources that have been shared in the chat. So if you want other things to be considered to be included in that final email, go ahead and reach out to me or Catherine. And once again, thanks for the 10 of us holding on to the bitter end, and just so appreciate you all. Have a lovely rest of your afternoon.